Hello and welcome back to Bigfoot Lake. Appreciate you stopping by tonight as we share two amazing Dogman encounters. Both of these encounters date back to 2015, and one is from the state of Ohio and the second encounter is from the state of Kansas. So with that being said, pull up a stump, sit back and relax, and let's dive into our first Dogman encounter from Pickaway County in Ohio. I'd like to tell you what happened to me one evening while hunting coyote on my father-in-law's land. It was about 6 or 7 p.m. and right at dusk. I was in a hunting blind on the edge of a ravine overlooking a creek about 30 feet down, and just beyond that, a cornfield. I was trying to call in a few because not a week had passed by since one of our neighbor's cows was mutilated, and we all assumed it to be from a coyote. Well, it was getting very dark, and I was about to leave when I heard steps walking up behind me. I called out in a low voice to my father-in-law, thinking it was him, letting him know I acknowledged his presence, and I lowered my crossbow. When I looked out the mesh window, I did not see him and was perplexed that he did not call back. That is when I heard sniffing right behind the blind, not 3 feet away. I was taken aback and excited, thinking that this must have been a coyote come to see what was in distress. I turned slowly in my chair, raising my crossbow, and that is when I heard the growl. It was a very deep and guttural sound, and I felt deep dread fall over me. I knew that whatever growled that deep was much larger than a coyote. I laid my crossbow down and I grabbed my .45 ACP sidearm I always carry while hunting, and I started to pray. I felt like I was in serious danger, and I might have a fight on my hands. I have been attacked by a wild dog before, and I still have the scars to this day. What I then saw walking away from the tent, it changed the course of my life, and it popped a safety bubble I did not even realize I have been living in my whole life while out hunting or spending time in the woods. I watched a wolf on his hind legs walk away from my blind along the edge of the ravine and then jump down, and it disappeared out of my sight. I exhaled and realized I was holding my breath, shaking and holding the .45 up and ready. This creature was at least as tall as me, and I am 5'10", and he was hunched down while walking away, so he had to be at least 7 feet tall standing upright. His fur was dark gray, and his back was heavily muscled, very defined. His arms were long and looked like he had hands, and I could see the tops of his ears over his hunched back. I never did see his face, but he had legs like a canine. I felt frozen and in disbelief. I wanted to both run as fast as I could out of there and also be still and ready in case this thing came back. After about a minute of deep breathing, I readied my things and slowly eased out of the blind, keeping my firearm up, sweeping the area as I moved towards my truck about 300 yards away. It was the hardest thing not to run full sprint, but darkness was coming on quick, and I did not want to be out there late with this thing. I made it to my truck and I sped out of there as fast as I could. Since that night, I have been struggling with what I saw and I went through. It's hard to talk to others. My family is very proper and practical, and would reduce what I saw to mere shadow, making a coyote seem bigger or something like that. It's comforting to know after researching that there are others that have seen things like this. I feel better just telling you this story. One other thing happened that I would like to share. I moved to an old house, only about 10 miles away from the land where I was hunting. And for about a week, my 2-year-old daughter would tell me about the bad wolf outside. This was about 2 years after my hunting incident, so I didn't think much of it at first. She kept on telling me about the bad wolf outside, and so I started getting concerned. I told her to come get me if she saw it again. And one night about 8 p.m., she comes to me saying, "Bad wolf outside." And she leads me to her room on the second story and tells me to look out the window. We have a floodlight out back, a huge chicken coop and a run area about 50 yards back, and then about 10 more yards past that is the wood line. I scan outside in the yard and I see nothing. Looking around the coop, thinking it to be my neighbor's dogs trying to get to my chickens, and I see nothing. Then I look at the wood line and I see it. Just like before, I see a large wolf creature standing in the wood line straight up and staring right at us. It was standing right behind a large wooden cross I had put up just at the wood line. The cross is about 9 feet tall, and this creature was shorter, but not by much. Again, I was frozen, but this time I was angry because it was at my home. It was watching my daughter and probably my whole family for who knows how long. I picked up my daughter and stared right back at this thing. It had yellowish glowing eyes from the floodlight reflection. I carried her and I called my son into my room while trying to stay calm. I put them both on the bed and go into my gun safe and grab my .45-70 lever rifle and head to the window, and I see that it is gone. I did not sleep much that night and had the kids sleep with my wife and me that night. I was staring outside for a long time. I have not seen it or any others since then, and I pray that I never do. I live near Circleville, Ohio, and like I said, it feels good just telling you this story. Thank you for taking the time if you made it this far into my story, and feel free to share with anyone with my experience. So that concludes our first story from the state of Ohio and Pickaway County. Now, this story struck me as fascinating because he describes this initial encounter while out hunting with this Dogman. And here we are, considerable amount of time later, and it's almost as if this thing had a connection with him at that point. I don't know if it was stalking him. I don't know what you would call that. But this thing showed up on the wood line and was staring at his house, and his young daughter saw it multiple times. So let me know what you think. Do you think this is possibly a stalking situation? This Dogman somehow had a connection with this gentleman in Circleville, Ohio. So let me know what you think. I'm curious to get some other thoughts on this, and I appreciate your thoughts. So with that story concluded, let's move to our second encounter of the night. Also another Dogman encounter, and this one comes from Jackson County, Kansas. It was summer break for my school, and I was lazily lounging at home watching TV. I got bored, so I went outside to see if I could do anything with my chickens, like feed them worms and snails. Before I go into more detail, I should explain the area I live in. My home is on the outskirts of the city I live in. I had about 5 or 7 chickens at the time, and we hadn't expanded the coop, so it was a small pen connecting to 2 sides of the chicken coop, which is wooden and sturdy. The only ways to get into the coop is either through the trap door attached to the big door and the 3 windows. One window was on one side of the door, and the second window was on the other side. The third window is a large window. Keep in mind that they all have traps connected to them, so they can be closed. We have 7 acres of woodland that we call the back pasture. And if you've ever been back there, you could see it's a popular habitat for the local deer. There was also a wild boar that was roaming around at the time, and I don't know how it got there. We had been having trouble with poachers for a while, considering the population of deer in the woods. One poacher had set up a trail cam, one that was motion activated. There was an old rusty deer stand that had been put on a tree a long time ago, and the tree had begun to grow around it. Beyond our acres of woods, there's a large cornfield owned by our neighbors, and beyond that is a forest. I don't know what the forest is like beyond the field since we've never been there. I went outside to do something with my chickens, and I had brought along a bucket of corn for feeding the deer after. When I walked out of my home, I saw a doe was sitting in the tall grass. I thought it was sleeping, since it had its head down and wasn't moving. I, being the curious little nut I was, decided that I would sneak up on the deer and get a picture of it to show to my mother when she got home from work. I crept as silently as I could across the yard that separated me from the deer. I should also mention that we have a clearing with a burn pit in it that was filled with cedar branches. I was creeping across my yard towards the deer, and when I had cleared the burn pit and was about 10 yards from it, I realized that the deer wasn't asleep, but it was dead. It was the most disgusting sight I had ever seen. Its intestines were completely gone. The flesh on the body of the doe shredded to pieces, and blood absolutely everywhere. It looked as if it had been sitting there for a while, and it smelled like it. Most of the blood was dried, and the air reeked with the stench of rotting flesh, urine, and what seemed like a hint of a wet dog. Something that creeped me out about the scene was, although it was a rotting carcass, there were no insects at all around it. It was as if the usual lively forest was deader than that deer. Not even the neighbor's cattle made a sound. It looked as if the poor deer had simply been left after being brutally attacked and half-eaten, which it most likely was. I left the bucket at the beginning of the trail, thinking I would come out later with my mother and grain the deer and when she got home. Then I started to walk back to my house. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard a low, snarling sound, a growl that sounded like a wolf, although it seemed distorted, as if it were being played on an old radio. Sorry, that's the only way I can think of describing it. Against my better judgment, I turned my head around, and I saw what looked like the biggest freaking wolf I'd ever seen. It was on all fours. Its fur was black and matted in places. Its face was what you'd expect a wolf to look like. although it was broad and the muzzle seemed a little short. Although the way it was curling its lips, it made it look as if the snout was plenty long, and its eyes were yellow. Not a bright yellow like the yellow of a flower or the sun, but a dim amber red yellow, if that makes sense. Its ears looked like that of a Doberman Pinscher, with a cropped effect. Its front legs were long, and it looked as if it were a bodybuilder. Its quote-unquote paws, if you can even call them paws, looked like huge hands with long claws at the end of them. It stood up, and I heard the most sickening popping sound you could ever imagine. It sounded like the sound of popping joints, but it seemed amplified, as if it were being played through a microphone, and the sound was coming out of loudspeakers. Its body looked like a bodybuilder's pumped up on steroids. It was so big. It had no tail that I could tell, and it seemed to tower over me, although I was a good 10 meters from it. I was about 5 foot 4 inches at the time, and I came nowhere close to its height. It was so tall that the tip of its ears could almost touch the top of a young cedar. It let out a loud howl, which sounded more like a roar, and it charged at me. Doing the only thing I knew to do while hyped up on fear and adrenaline, I began to run away from it. I remember clearing my yard in what seemed like hours, but was most likely only in a few seconds, and running inside, slamming and locking all of the doors and windows. As I calmed down a little bit, I had realized that if it had really wanted to kill me, that it would have. What I had experienced was not an attack charge, but a bluff. I was lucky to get away with my life. Although this happened almost 2 years ago, it still terrifies me to think about it. The deer was gone the next day, and ever since that evening, I have been weary around the woods, only going in them in broad daylight, only when I absolutely had to, and never without a weapon. Sadly, I cannot say that I am one of those people that have stopped experiencing things after the encounter, although I only had nightmares for a month after that day in June. Nothing really started to happen again until about 2 months ago, when I was staying up at night playing on the laptop. I had started to hear things moving around on the porch, and turned on the light to see the shape of something huge disappearing behind the corner of my house. There was also one of the rare times I went into the woods after the first encounter, when I was helping my mother clear brush from the hunting clearing. I was going to get the mower and was walking the trail to do so when I heard bipedal footsteps following me off to my side. They stopped whenever I stopped, and eventually I ran out of the woods, and I haven't been back since. I asked my late great-grandmother about the creature I had seen in the woods, and she informed me that there was something called the wolf-head man that stalked the Kansa tribe, preying on small children that strayed too far from their teepees. Later, I was informed by my history teacher that my house had been actually built on a tribal burial ground, and I have since been wondering if that had something to do with it. I hadn't heard about the wolf-head man before she had told me about. When I saw that there were several eyewitness reports that were proved to be truthful, it made me feel a lot better about coming out with this information. I had attempted to tell people previous to this, but everyone either said I was stupid crazy, or just a plain liar. One thing's for certain: I am not stupid, I am not crazy, and I am most definitely not a liar. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a Dogman. That concludes our second story, and that is an amazing, amazing encounter. And once again, we have this encounter in the forest with this Dogman creature, and then we have a follow-up to it. It's almost like this creature came closer to the house, almost as if it's another stalking incident. And then when he went to his great-grandmother about the creature, and she described it as the wolf-head man that stalked the Kansa tribe, preying on small children that strayed too far from their teepees. Again, this is fascinating information. Have you guys heard of situations where dogmen actually stalk somebody, where there's an encounter, and then it's followed up with another encounter? Perhaps even a history of encounters. Let me know what you think. Have you heard other encounters like this with the stalking aspect? I'd love to get you guys' thoughts on this, and let me know in the comments. Did you enjoy the two Dogman stories? I'd appreciate your thoughts. And I want to thank each and every one of you for stopping by Bigfoot Lake tonight to hear the two encounters of the Dogman. Appreciate each and every one of you. Hope you have a great night, and hit that thumbs up on the way out the door tonight. So have a great night, and we will see you on the next.